Yes, it is. I spoke to the translators. They asked us to just watch our pace. But
I speak so fast naturally.
yeah, I hear ya. Oy. God, can you tell I don't do this very much? This is on. Off, I guess, until you're done.
Hello, and welcome to Deca. I'm going to speak in English, so I hope that's okay with everybody. I'm going to basically, first of all, explain what we're doing and why we're doing it, and the details, and then Marc is going to be the one who actually gives the thoughtful insights about what it means and so on, the lessons we've learned so far. And then we'll have some questions for anybody who wants to ask them. So I'm going to start with a bit of history, which is about 60 years ago, a group of 40 photojournalists, including Robert Capa and Henri Cartier-Bresson, revolutionized the relationship between photographers and people who looked at photography. New technologies had put photojournalism in a state of flux, had made new things happen. There was light, portable 35mm cameras, new film processing was easier and cheaper, and you no longer needed the resources of a big organization to do it. A single photographer working alone could go out in the world, find the stories they thought were most important, and come back and bring them and publish them essentially through magazines in that case, but still almost directly from the photojournalist to the viewer. So what they did was form an organization, and this organization was called Magnum, and it was the first modern photo agency. And it had two important characteristics. First of all, it was owned, and more importantly, controlled by the photographers themselves. And then the photos were owned not by the magazine, not by the newspaper, but by Magnum, by the photo agency, by the photographers. And these two things, combined with the new technologies, changed forever the way that photojournalism was done. Photographers no longer had to wait and get the approval of an editor in New York and Paris and anywhere else who may not know what was happening. They could choose the stories they thought were most important, the stories they wanted to tell, and go out in the field and tell them. And the result, if anybody knows the work of Robert Capa or of Henri Cartier-Bresson, is evident for everybody. So the question we want to ask with Deca is whether we're now facing a similar moment. This time not with photographers, but with writers. I've lost my space in the zone. But anyway, not with photographers, but with writers. We have new technologies again. We have the Kindle, we have the tablets, the iPhone, we have the Amazon store, we have the App Store from Apple. And these are all technologies that allow writers like us to take our work directly to readers. And so the question we want to ask with what we're doing is it possible to recreate that Magnum Moment and to form an organization that will allow us to bring stories in a different way and pursue the stories we want to do and hopefully change the way that stories are told. So what is Deca? Deca, like Magnum, is a cooperative of, in our case, long-form storytellers with an international focus. We're 9 writers. Hopefully we'll soon be 10. We're still looking for, we've been talking to a few people about joining us. And all of us have a great deal of experience in the world of traditional journalism. We've all written books for major publishers. We've written for magazines like Time Magazine, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Fortune, The New York Times Magazine, Harper's, Bloomberg Businessweek, Rolling Stone, GQ, National Geographic, Outside, Science, the list goes on. I'll pause for a second to let the translator catch up. We all live around the world. I live in Rome. I write for Time Magazine and for Businessweek from Rome. I wrote a book called Forecasts about the human impacts of climate change. Marc lives in Barcelona. He's the author of The Shores of Tripoli, a Kindle single based on his reporting from the Libyan civil war. We have Mara Vistendal, who's a contributing editor at Science Magazine based in Shanghai. Her book, Unnatural Selection, which is about sex-selective abortions mostly in Asia, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Number 4 is Sonia Falero, whose book Beautiful Thing, about a bar dancer in Bombay, won too many awards for me to list. She'll be between London and India. Delphine Schrank is in Washington, D.C. She used to live in Southeast Asia. She's currently finishing a book based on 4 years of reporting undercover in Burma. We have Vanessa Gazzari in New York. She teaches at Columbia University, and she's the author of a book called The Tender Soldier, about the use by the U.S. military of social scientists like anthropologists and sociologists to help fight the war in Afghanistan. And the last three, Mackenzie Funk is in Seattle. He wrote a book about climate change called Windfall. It was published earlier this year. We have Tom Zollner in California, in Los Angeles, who teaches at Chapman University and has written 5 books, most recently about his love affair with trains. And then Donovan Hone, who's a former editor, features editor at GQ and a contributing editor at Harper's, and he's now teaching creative writing in Michigan, and he's the author of Moby Duck, in which he crisscrossed the Pacific Ocean following the trail of nearly 30,000 rubber duckies that had been swept off a sea and then were swept off a ship and were swept all over the world. And it kind of explains how the world is connected. So at one point we, for the fun of it, decided to count how many countries we've reported from as a group. And after about 90, we decided that was enough and we stopped counting. We've reported from every single continent except for Antarctica. And so we're working on Antarctica. So
it's just really cold, man.
So what we do is that each one of us is going to write a story. The plan is to write a story of a year, around 10,000 or 15,000 words. And we've been debating whether this is more like a long magazine article or a short book. We think in the end it's going to be more like a short book, in that we're looking for stories that are timeless, that tell a story, that engage a reader, which a reader kind of leaves changed at the end of the time that they've read it. And we'll be selling these through distribution platforms like Amazon's Kindle store, and we're making an app that'll be available through the Apple Store and hopefully other platforms soon. So we each write our own stories, but at the same time, we're cooperative and we're working together as a team. Each partner, every time a writer writes a book, one of us becomes his or her editor, and we work together to make the book as good as possible and to recreate some of the dialogue and cooperation of a newsroom, which in many cases is getting harder and harder to find as a journalist. And then every story, before we publish it, has to be voted on by the group, and it needs a unanimous approval. So we want to make sure that the works we're putting out are as good as possible. There's also an economic part to what we're doing. Most of the money for each sale is going to go to the writer. A little bit is going to go to the editor. But some of it's going to go towards Deca itself. And we're going to use that to pay for copy editing, for covers that'll make the books compelling and hopefully interesting to readers, for some portion of travel expenses, legal costs, promotion. But we're hoping that there'll be enough left over that at the end of the year, we'll be able to distribute it. And so therefore, we take the distribution, take the money, and in what's a very kind of famously spiky industry where some books might do okay and one book might take off. In this case, if one of us gets a big hit, we're all going to benefit. And so it also gives an incentive for all of us working together to work hard and make sure every book does as well as possible. So we've already been doing this for about a year, working on the back end, trying to figure out how to make things work. We're all, I think, accomplished, it's fair to say, journalists. We're not a single one of us is an accomplished business person, and so it's been a learning experience as to on the very basics things of that. But it's I think we've got that mostly under control, and we're moving forward. And at the end of this month, we're going to publish our first work, and it's going to be what looks like, I haven't seen the final text yet, but a really fascinating murder mystery in Shanghai about a Canadian woman who moved to Shanghai to work as a model, found it was a very different type of engagement that she had hoped for, and she was murdered in her apartment complex. And Mara, who's writing the book, went to British Columbia to talk to her family and to find out who she was, and she also went to go to the home of the person who was executed for killing her. And so the story becomes a story about how two people from essentially the countryside moved to the big city and got eaten by it. Along with Mara's book, we'll be doing a Kickstarter campaign, which we hope will raise some funds for developing apps for new platforms, for helping us make audio versions, for taking care of some of the mundane legal stuff that you need to make something like this. And then we'll be doing probably another book 2 weeks afterwards, another book 2 weeks after that, and then we'll be going towards a more monthly publication schedule. So the last thing we're going to talk about is the lineup, more or less, for the books after the first one. We've got a kind of a perfect storm style story about a runaway oil rig in the Arctic Circle. We have a dispatch from Catalonia, where people want to break away from Spain. And we've got a story about silver mines in the Bolivian Andes and the tourists who go to these places with quite a tragic history and what that means about tourism and our relation to it. And then I'm doing a story about immigration and borders, for which I made a trip to Lampedusa in November after the shipwreck where more than 300 people died. So as far as we know, this model has never been tried before for long-form journalism, the cooperative Magnum model, and we're excited to do our best to make it work. So thank you, and I'm going to hand it over to Marc.
So, is this on? Oh, yes. So Stephan paints the optimistic, historical, triumphal version and then passes to me where I talk about money and challenges and what we've learned in the past year. And obviously, as we've all learned over the past couple of days, you know, there's a lot of experimentation going on, and they are all experiments. And sometimes things blow up in laboratories, and sometimes they don't. And we're very optimistic, but I wanted to briefly go through some of the challenges and some of the changes that we're going to make from previous models, and why. And I want to try to keep this brief because what we'd really like to do also is not just answer a few questions, but hear a lot of questions, because a lot of what we're doing is gathering insights from you, from other journalists, and from readers about what might be the best way to move forward. The first thing is we've heard a lot about the notion of self-publishing on the fiction side, and that makes sense. The fiction writers years ago had kind of a raw deal, because if you know, a work of imagination just requires time and an imagination, and those are not small things, but neither of them are money. To be a reporter, fundamentally, you need money. You need to be able to go to Lampedusa and talk to people. You need to be able to buy gear. You need to do a lot of things. So when fiction writers went to traditional publishers, book publishers particularly, and said, here's my novel that I wrote at night, what do you say? The fiction people could say, sort of like a venture capitalist, yeah, here's $5,000. And they couldn't really do anything about that unless they had a really wily agent who could get them at a bidding war or something like that. Whereas when I sold a book, I showed up and I said, here's my idea. And the hard part was getting the idea to catch on with an editor. And once that happened, with the help of an agent, they were kind of obligated to fund my research, because otherwise the book doesn't get written, or it stinks, and that doesn't help anyone. So they have to give you real money. What that meant is that when digital came along, the fiction writers jumped fast and hard, and they cooperated and they collaborated, and they were good at it. And because they had nothing to lose, you know? So they really moved the needle. What went along with that, though, was a certain judgmental air, you know? These were people who couldn't really get an agent, or these were people who couldn't really get published any other way, or that whole vanity press thing, right? It never really got tried in journalism until very, very recently. When Kindle singles started happening, they started commissioning, but they weren't giving much money either. But what happened? Surprise, journalists went to them. And 2 years ago, I went to them and I said, I've written a story for The Atlantic. It's 800 words long. It got a bit of attention. What would you say to 12,000 words? And they said yes. And we wrote the story. It got edited. It got published. It made enough money to pay for the research, to pay for itself, and to actually pay a little more. Was it a huge bestseller? No. But was it a workable model? Yes. So you look at what the fiction writers did next. The fiction writers formed groups. They had writing groups. They had cooperative groups. As a journalist, you cooperate all the time. You know this. When you're in the field, you talk, you know. In fact, we're criticized for moving in packs, right? But in fact, we don't compete in the classic sense. We work together. And yet, as soon as we get to the door of the publisher, we're told, compete viciously, you know? There are 5 pages in Harper's this month, and Stephan can have them or Marc can have them, but you can't both have them. Well, that's just ridiculous, frankly, in this era. So by collaborating, could we address that problem? Could we approach it like the fiction writers did? And we think we can, yeah. There's the vanity press problem or notion, which is if you read something in the New York Times, it comes with a brand and it comes with a sort of a mark of quality. Well, if we show up with, all of us have 10, 15, 20 years of experience with big titles and these titles that don't really have business models that work anymore, we sidestep that problem because we can say, look, this isn't about us sneaking into the castle. Frankly, we've been in the castle. We live in the castle. The castle's lights are kind of flickering. We're a little worried, but this isn't about us looking for a way to get published because frankly, we're all doing it around our day jobs and we're all kind of too busy. We have work, but to create a new model on top of this necessarily suggests that we look for something that's different, that cooperation is something different, and cooperation is something that allows us to do things that replace the old business model, we think. We're trying. Sorry, I'm just looking at notes here. I just want to we were talking about this last night. I want to very briefly describe how a traditional story would be made and how we're going to differ from this. If both Stephan and I pitch a book to a publisher, and it's the same publisher and they're both accepted, then a year later there's a meeting about marketing, and his editor and my editor argue with each other about how much of the marketing budget from that quarter they get to promote our books. So we're necessarily in competition with each other. Because we're all 9 publishing together under one brand, that doesn't happen. Our marketing resources are the marketing resources for each book, each month that we publish. And we are all using social networks, using Twitter, using our combined, to use an old term, Rolodexes that we've acquired over 15, 20 years of work for these publications to diffuse all of that, because we all, I think it's fair to say, believe that these stories don't need to be mutually exclusive. I think you can read 20,000 words or 15,000 words on the meaning of borders written from Lampedusa by Stephan in 45 minutes and have an enriching experience and learn something and have it be good journalism and have it be good writing and have it be something that you want to show your friends and think about a year later when you see another boat went down. And then a month later, read a story about a young woman who went to Shanghai and found it wasn't what she'd been sold, and a young man who also came to Shanghai and their tragic encounter and what that means about modern China and what that means about immigration and what it means about a lot of things. You can do both of those things because they're 45 minutes each, a month apart. And in the current publishing model, you can't do both of those things because there's only 5 pages and the editor has to pick one or the other, and I just don't buy that. So that's part of what the collaborative model is about. There's also a question of scale. And by scale, what we're sort of saying, how much do we really need to do to continue to make this happen, to make these stories exist? And working together, it's much less. I mean, it sounds like a stupidly obvious thing, but the fact is we live in this era where they're telling journalists that you have to brand yourself and you have to be a blog and you have to be, I have to be my byline. I just left a magazine after 2 years where I was barely edited and barely staff or whatever because I was supposed to build my brand, Well, I could do that, but it's a ton of work. And the idea of building a brand with 9 or 10 other people is just much, much, much more attractive because for all of you to have to know all of us and sort of be like, oh, right, Stephan, he did that thing about borders like 6 months ago, right? Yeah, I guess I'll look for him again. Really? Are you going to do that? But to say Deca is to say this organization that does this thing, this, this literary journalism about, your world and these kinds of stories, this kind of Granta Harper style reportage, you know what it means. And that's just an easier sell, frankly, than the idea that I'm going to be marketer, photographer, writer, researcher, fact checker, all by myself, and he is too, and we're going to move in parallel. Doesn't make any sense. I would much rather read his story than compete with it. Just a few other things, and then I'd like to ask, if there's any other questions. Some other people have done similar-ish things that give us hope. Matter is doing stuff in the science realm that's finding success, and it's interesting. we've joked about saying, okay, well, if the old newspaper was, news, weather, sports, style, whatever, maybe these kind of projects start evolving similarly. So Matter's doing science, and we're doing kind of international, and others are doing sports and so on. I think that's a viable thing that could happen. Atavist is doing multimedia. Maybe some of you have heard of that. We're not doing multimedia. We're doing text. We're doing books. We might put a picture or a map in here or there, but mostly we're telling stories. And Plimpton is on the fiction side, but I mentioned them because they're doing serialization, which is interesting, and they're doing okay with that, where you buy, for $2 or $3 installments of stories that probably do add up to the price of a $15 paperback, but it's over the course of a year. And they're doing okay at that too. So we do know that these things sell. And then of course there's Kindle singles, and we know that they still exist a couple of years on, and people are doing well with that, and people are telling stories that wouldn't have otherwise gotten told, because you can't find 15,000 words in the pages of The Atlantic these days. You just can't. And some stories deserve 15,000 words. So I think that's my little business side shtick. I can sort of prompt some of the questions that we frequently get, or if you have questions, fire away. But I should say too, we're launching our first story next month, and we're launching a Kickstarter next month, and I mentioned both those things to say that while we've been putting all this together and thinking this stuff through, we've also been reporting. I mean, Stephan's downplaying it. He went to Lampedusa in the middle of that mess. And then meanwhile, we're emailing about should we call these magazines or both? We're all this conceptual business building stuff. Do we need to call a lawyer? And meanwhile, he's in Lampedusa, Mara went to Canada and sat with the family of this woman who had just disappeared, I took the cheapskate route and wrote about the town I live in, so I really shouldn't talk about myself. But, people have been reporting, and, our hope is, through sales, that we're going to pay half the reporting costs for all of the stories we publish, because that's important. It doesn't necessarily lower your costs as a freelancer. What it does is it allows you to do twice as much, which gets our budget to the point where they start looking comparable to the expense account that, Mother Jones would give you or The Atlantic would give you. I'm totally confident we can compete with those people because we already pitched those people. And if we feel confident enough to write for them, we certainly should feel confident enough to hold our stories up on the newsstand next to theirs too. And all of those things can exist, and you can read all of them, and that's great. So that's our little song and dance. It's a very simple concept, frankly. It's just a lot of work.
So does anybody have any questions? Yeah, we need a microphone, I think.
Yeah. We have a microphone. I'll bring it to you. Here we go. Oh, here we go. Oh, I'll go.
Thanks. I will ask both of you, because I'm actually part of a journalist collective in Vienna, and we're in sort of the same stage as you. We've been existing for a year, but we don't know really what our business model is going to be like. So what I wanted to ask about is, do you have contracts with each other? Do you work on a trust basis? And also about the financial part, do you already know how to split between, let's say, a writer, an editor, and the general costs?
We do.
Yeah.
I would be really interested.
Part of the, if you want to come up afterwards, we can give you some of the details. But we part of the process that's been this learning process that's not on the journalism side but on the business side is to figure out. I mean, the legal document will be called an operating agreement. We've actually registered Deca as a company in the United States, and we have rules for how to make decisions, for how to let members in, for how to kick members out that are not working. We have rules for how to split the income and what the income can be spent on, and how to make those decisions as well. And one of these things where when you say we want to make a Magnum for writers, you can say it in 30 seconds, and then you start realizing all the different things you have to do to actually make that happen in a way that doesn't mean that 6 months from now you're fighting over money. So the answer is yeah.
Well, editors, maybe something that's interesting to you is that the editors on the pieces will receive a small but significant percentage of sales. So again, everyone's got a stake. It's a cooperative thing, and we all benefit when the books sell. This also, it should be said, will allow us to do stories that are more or less marketable. It's really hard to tell what people will read and what they won't read, but we are borrowing something from traditional publishing that is almost, I hate to put it this way, it's just sort of a venture capital model where we're going to put out 10 stories, and like Stephan said, if one of them hits, kind of all boats go up. But the journalistic and editorial advantage of that is that if I want to write about Catalan secession, which hopefully I'll do in a way that's universal and interesting and, homage to Catalunya, hooray, but it's not maybe as obvious as saying, a young woman who comes to grief in Shanghai, right? So it creates a certain freedom. Because if I needed to pitch that story in New York right now, hey, there's this fascinating thing about this little place that you haven't really thought about since 1992 that's doing this really weird thing that's kind of like Scotland. You've heard of Scotland, right? It's a non-starter. But I'm convinced that people will read it and people will buy it. So we can kind of play those off each other. It creates freedom, basically, editorial freedom, ideally. Anyone else? Think of something, or I'll have to ask him a question.
We have a question here.
Adulto oppure a tutti i lettori?
Non ho capito.
I vostri scritti
Sì.
sono rivolti a un pubblico adulto?
Adulto? But the short answer is yes. We're writing magazine stories that are hard news. Potentially, anybody can read it. I actually have an idea for a second book that might also be interested to younger readers, but for the most part, we're trying to do the type of news stories that would be in a book of nonfiction, serious nonfiction, or a magazine article of serious nonfiction. Did I answer the question? Okay.
E gli editor come ripartiscono le loro percentuali? Sono fissate prima oppure secondo la vendita del numero delle copie?
Yeah, well, we have a defined formula for how to split the income. I don't know if we haven't discussed as a group whether to make the exact numbers public, so I don't want to say what they are. But no, they're defined beforehand, and it's a certain amount that goes to the writer, a certain amount goes to the editor, and a certain amount goes to the group as to again be spent on the operating costs for the group, and then redistributed if there's money available.
I think the important thing to keep in mind is that we're also editing in turns. So, eventually I'm going to edit Stephan. I'm not this time, but there's this sort of volleyball rotation thing that we did. And I probably shouldn't say this out loud, but we actually originally formed the editor-writer pairs by asking the 2-year-old of one of our members to pull the names out of a hat. So some of the stuff we're doing in a very programmatic, clear way, and other ways, after kind of bouncing around ideas for a week and a half, we go, let's just, okay, tails, we'll do it this way. We really are learning as we go. Yeah.
So you are not going to publish the stories in the web?
No.
No, and it's this is a key point. If I were to write the story that I'm writing now for a magazine, if I were to pitch it and they would say, don't write it at 15,000, write it at 5,000 for Harper's or something like that, Harper's would be paying me, they would be using print advertising to pay me, and then they would be asking you for $5 to read me and the other 2 features that they published. If you add up the 3 features that a magazine like Harper's publishes, that's 15,000 words, so basically you're paying $5 for 15,000 words. So that's that. If we put it on the web, a couple of things happen. One is there's the expectation that it's free. That was built in the original sin of web journalism that we've all been talking about for several days now. But the other thing that happens is that you're not on a reader, reading books and conceptualizing these stories as books is to say this is an immersive experience. This is a story. This begins, I arrived in Lampedusa on a plane and it looked like this and it felt like this and it smelled like this, right? This isn't a tweet and this isn't a blog post, and both of those things are very important. And tweets and blog posts may have been the seeds for the later thing that turned into this. But what it means is you're in an e-reader, you're in a tablet, you've got to click 2 or 3 times to get out of that. I've worked for web magazines. I know what it's like to compete with yesterday's sports core and the weather and Twitter and porn and movie recaps and the whole enormous universe. I also know what it's like to sit down with the New York Review of Books and read Marc talking about security. And, I know which one I would rather be putting our stories in. You know?
Have you made any plan to go multilingual with your publications?
It's a really good question. To go multilingual.
It's something we've discussed, but it's not on the immediate plans. Marc's Kindle single in Libya has been translated into German already, and it's again we're making this up a little bit as we go along, and it's going to be depending a bit on what the market is and whether that makes sense.
If I could add something, I mean, just speaking personally, not for the group, that's something important for me because the single I did was about Libya, and the people I was writing about, some of them spoke English, but a lot of them didn't, and they couldn't read it. So that was a problem, and then also they couldn't download it even, you know, because Kindle doesn't go into Arabic and into Egypt and these kinds of things. And I felt terrible, and I was emailing with people, and it was a sort of a serious story, and I really wanted to send this in some way. So there are a couple of ways of thinking about this. One is, if you go through Amazon's store right now, then you have to go where Amazon has a market. You know, Amazon Crossing, which is their translation wing. Hello. Bezos doesn't like what I'm saying. Oh, okay, sorry. Hi, Jeff. Did I just kill the project? I may have just killed the project. Anyway, Amazon Crossing paid for the translation and put it into German and retitled it, which was funny because I don't speak German, so I had to like write German-speaking friends and be like, "What's my book called?" Oh God! I actually said like, "There's this crazy word on the front page. I don't know what it says," and they wrote back, "It means table of contents." But I mean, it was a sort of an opaque process, to be perfectly honest. But why did they put it into German? Because they were launching a German Kindle store, and so that's great. Except it means that Amazon's business plan defines the translation. I really want to be in Arabic. German's nice, but I really want to be in Arabic. You know, so is this something we'll move toward? Right now, we're building a business from scratch. Right now, we're building a business model from scratch, and we have to some degree, go with what we know. The other thing is, would we at some point have contributors who are bilingual who will want to do this themselves? I think it would be fabulous. You know, but I feel like we have to kind of learn to walk before we run. Thanks for the question. Oh, and thumbs up to the translators in the back of the room, by the way. Is that a question over there?
Am I on? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So I just wanted to say thank you, first of all. I really love reading long-form nonfiction, and sometimes it can be kind of hard to find, so I'm really excited to know about this. And I'm curious, as a younger journalist, this is a totally selfish question, if you guys have any advice for young people who are really interested in long-form, places that they might find a collective to join, or just general advice about career path and life path.
See, I knew this day would come. I'm now old. See, I wanted to ask that question. The best piece of advice I got when I was an intern back when dinosaurs were our readers was to not take a job like writing. That was a print era. It was a different world. I'm not sure it really pertains. But the idea of not disappearing down the fact-checking rabbit hole or not disappearing down any of the various sort of go out and write stuff, keep writing things and keep writing things. It sounds like a cliche, but it's sort of true. You kind of have to do the job that you want to have. That's the best piece of advice I got. Of course, I was broke for many years off of that advice. So, also eat a lot now, like carbo load. Yeah. I'm really skinny. That's not a coincidence. This is not DNA. Yeah. Sorry.
So, I mean, for one thing, what we're doing here is possible for you to do too. So,
absolutely.
There's nothing stopping, and I think it would be fantastic if more of these things sprung up. Probably the best thing that I ever did as a journalist was to move to Nigeria with a few $1,000s in my pocket and find stories there and start pitching stories there that had a whole country that was almost uncovered by the international press. And it changed the way I thought about journalism, it changed the way I thought about Nigeria, it changed everything. And it's something I really quite enjoyed.
And read a lot. That's my other last thing. You know, this notion of long form is very recent. We're using this term because I guess that's the buzzword, and when you read it in the program, you guys kind of know what kind of conversation we're going to have. But we were just talking before about this, that you know, if you go back and you read sort of classic feature writing, was that long form? I don't know. Was Hiroshima long form? Was The Road to Wigan Pier long form? I don't know. They're just fantastic retellings of times in history, and frankly, there was a point where I read all of them, and you know, that really helps because they're better at that stuff than, you know, I am. Anyone else?
Sì, in che anno avete iniziato? Quale anno quando è iniziata la vostra attività del Deca?
Maggio 2014.
2014.
Yeah, 1956. He looks great, doesn't he? Yeah.
No, May 2014.
Oh, you didn't say 1914?
No.
Oh, damn.
Ok.
I was hoping.
È un'idea la vostra che potrei copiare. Io sono un editore e scrittore, mi sono fatto da solo, quindi pubblico nell'Umbria. Potrebbe essere un'idea perché io lo faccio senza scopo di lucro, solo per divertimento. Quindi per me potrebbe essere un suggerimento che mi date di poter invogliare i nuovi giovani scrittori che non trovano spazio per le loro pubblicazioni.
Tieni il microfono più lontano.
Sì, scusa, non sono un esperto. Per le loro pubblicazioni, quindi organizzare questa società per dare spazio a questi nuovi scrittori. Grazie.
Well, you know, it's interesting. You know, he was saying that, you know, this sort of idea can inspire people to tell stories in these kinds of ways. It's funny because we've kind of come full circle then when you're saying something like that, because just a few years ago, everyone was saying, you know, screw applying for the job at the city desk for $16,000 a year, just start a blog, right? And then, you know, throw a rock and you're going to hit somebody who made a career off of that, who ended up at Reuters and so on and so forth because they started a blog. Brown Moses started as a blog. Felix Salmon started as all these people who we now know of as brands, right? But to do the kind of work we're talking about doing, which is the stuff we've been doing with magazines all of our careers that added value to those magazines and what sold those magazines, which is the closely reported, closely observed, well-written, thoughtful, blah, blah, is very hard to do as a blogger, frankly. There are people who can do it. It's a rare talent, but if you say like a young person, you know, now can just start a blog and make a brand out of themselves and do that, I don't think they can really actually do that and explain what's happening in the Central African Republic today. Can you report from there and add public value? Absolutely. Can you write a 15,000-word story that's going to be read in 30 years? I'm skeptical, honestly. I think to do that, you need to create a business model, you need to create a group, you need to help each other, you need to think about the details, you need to absolutely replace the structures that magazines used to provide for us to do that work, and those structures are disappearing. I mean, we were joking that when we wrote out our bios, we were constantly having to sort of play with the grammar because we'd all written for the same places. Well, what does that tell you? That tells you that the market is this big, you know, and we were just 9 people. If you had 50 bios for people who were regularly writing for, you know, these kinds of magazines, all the Sunday magazines are almost gone. The Sunday supplements are almost gone. The market is... So if this stuff's still going to exist, we need to make another place to put it, and that's what we're trying to do. And the cooperative model is a way to try to replace what magazines were doing and also try to improve upon it a little. What I was saying before about some of the inefficiencies in how books are marketed and how books are acquired and those kinds of things. And to be slightly more pejorative, books, you know, the book industry, at least in the Anglophone world, isn't terribly good at selling books. I mean, there's still a lot of just like, let's throw it at the wall and see what sticks. And we're going to try to be more intelligent, honestly, about how we market. So we're trying to take what's good from the model, but also improve on it. And could a bunch of young people do that? Absolutely. But is it as easy as going to WordPress and saying, like, now I am, you know, Marc's thoughts, you know, /wordpress.org? I think there's a little more to it. And that's what we've learned in a year.
So I think actually I'm maybe less pessimistic on blogs than you are. I think blogs are a wonderful form, and I think someone could cover the CAR via a blog. But you, I think, as a journalist, to answer your question, you have to do what you like doing and what you like reading, I think, more than anything else. And you know, the 9 of us, it's fair to say, all got into this business because we read the type of pieces that we want to write. And I think if you're someone who's very comfortable in writing 500-word snippets and hitting things often and doing a blog, that's fantastic. I think there's a great deal of value in that. But I think if you want to we want to provide a story that, hopefully each story will change the way you see the world to some small amount and will immerse you and be an experience that you remember. And that's the stuff we want to produce. The other issue with blogs versus what we're trying to do is that so far, I think with the very few exceptions, actually maybe even almost no exceptions, nobody's really figured out how to make a blog pay for the journalist. Hopefully this will work. At the moment, for whatever reason, in the mind of the public, there is a difference between what's online and what's regarded more as a book. And people have been willing to pay for a book, but what's online has been completely devalued. Andrew Sullivan is probably the most successful blogger ever. And he's recently put up a paywall and is asking for subscriptions. And he's surviving and he's making it, but he's certainly not making a great deal of money. And if that's the top person working in that medium, and he's barely, he's making it, but, and he's not doing reportage. Right, and he's not doing, and he's not doing any type of his costs. Well, he's got a staff, so he's got costs, but at the same time, right. If that's the top of the field, and that's what's being made possible so far, that's not necessarily a space that we want to move into.
There's one more elephant in the room here, which is this notion that we've heard so much at this festival, this notion of engagement, where traditional publishers and traditional magazines are still kind of in this notion of we produce a thing, we make a thing, and you give us money, and we give it to you. And that's the relationship. And we know more and more that that's not where it's at anymore, that if we're going to produce reportage, if we're going to produce 15,000-word stories, we also want to hear from people, and we want to create an architecture that allows people to talk to us about this, and not just people in this sort of anthropological sense who are, readers of fancy magazines in rich countries, but I want to hear from my sources. I want to hear from people. I'm writing about Catalonia. There's a language barrier question, but I want to hear from Catalans. I want to hear from Spaniards. I want to hear from people at The Hague. I want to hear from people in Strasbourg. And I want to, just hear from general readers. When I published a traditional book, I would go to book readings and people would talk to me and it was great, And so there's also a space by which we can say, we're producing this reportage and we're producing these books, but also you will be able to talk to us in a way that in a previous magazine world you kind of couldn't. And our work will improve and the experience will improve and the whole relationship will be different than was true in traditional magazine writing. Which is not to say that we're not all making our livings, frankly, still as magazine writers, but one must push the ball down the road, The can down the road, the ball, metaphor, sorry.
How are you going to structure your website? You're talking about interacting with readers, so maybe you're going to have some discussion spaces. Are you thinking about such things?
Yes, we think a lot about them. Do you want to take that? How are we going to structure the website?
The website is still a work in progress. It's certainly something I would like to have. I think that when we launch in May, the website's going to have the splash page you see here, a few writers and links to our bios and so forth. But, one thing, we live in a world where social media is important. And again, I don't want to be on the web where Andrew Sullivan is, but we want to make some part of this shareable. So Amazon has Goodreads. We could do a forum of some sort on our website. We also, I think, have discussed putting at least the first few hundred words of a story on our website so that people can read it and say, hey, this is great, and then click through to Amazon, to our app, or somewhere else to keep on reading it. But obviously, we all have Twitter accounts. Deca Stories is the Twitter account for Deca, and these conversations now are happening everywhere. I write for Time Magazine and Business Week, and they have comment pages on their websites. I rarely read those because I rarely find them very good, but people do sometimes interact with me on Twitter and say, hey, I disagreed here, or I didn't like this, or my email is also on my website, so people have written me that way. So in some sense, the opportunity to interact is already there, and it's wonderful. It's a really exciting time to be a journalist. It's really fantastic.
I was wondering, do you think any of you will find themselves in a situation of being in competition with, say, Time or any of the magazines or legacy media you work for, say, we're going to keep this story because it's really, really good for Deca, and we agree that it's going to be a book, and at the same time, maybe Time would be interested.
Yeah.
How will you take these decisions?
It's a good question.
It's up to every individual writer where they want to take it. I mean, I write for two essentially competing magazines, and some of them times I take it to Time, and sometimes I take the Business Week. They do have different focuses, and they do actually want different things from me, so it hasn't been much of a conflict so far. Well, we all make our choices. We the way that magazine writing kind of works, you have an idea and you start thinking, where's the best place for this? And you start there, and if they say no, you go to the next best place. And here we're adding a new place that we have control over. And, some stories will say, I absolutely want to do it here because I want to have full control. And I don't want to have to be changed in the ways I'm not comfortable with by my editors. And other times you might say, well, you know what, this is, maybe not something that is going to revolutionize or change the way people think, and maybe I'd be better off taking it as a more hardcore news story to a news magazine. Or so it's what we're doing is we're adding hopefully one more space to the ecosystem that we're working and living in.
So if I can add just briefly to that too, the news weeklies that you're working for are a different economic proposition than, say, monthlies. The whole, for the number of pieces that's published, the New Yorker's weekly, but most of the monthlies, they publish very few features in a year. There are just not many slots, and some of them are taken up by contributing editors. I've had a contributing editor gig. You have a huge advantage. Even if somebody shows up with an extraordinary story, they've already paid you that month, so they want you to create value there. And the poor person who shows up with a great story gets the phone call saying, this is fabulous, but we can't make this pencil out. We can't both pay this guy's salary who we feel is going to produce more over a year than you. So that creates a sort of it's terribly boring, I'm sorry, but there's a value proposition question where if I want to go out and pitch a story to the New Yorker, there's a ton of work that goes into the pitch. There's research that goes into the pitch. If I want to pitch a book, I'm going to spend a lot of money because I have to create a 20,000 word sample chapter and all of that kind of stuff. So in some ways, the disincentives for a shrinking news hole in traditional media, I can't pitch it to the digital side of these magazines because they're paying three figures if they're paying anything. If I go for the $2 word that's going to allow me to keep my kid in clean socks, there's a several-month process. You never know. Maybe it gets killed and you only get 15% because your editor decided to go on vacation. Somebody else did. So in some ways, Deca just says, look, the risk, there's opportunity cost and there's risk. And your opportunity cost by doing this through the group negates the risk that you're taking on by even knocking on the New Yorker's door or Harper's door. And up till a few years ago, I was willing to take that risk. And at this point, I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. Particularly when they say, like, yeah, but it'll be a story in the New York Times Magazine. It'll help your career. To do what, then? The loss leaders have to stop at some point, Anyway, sorry. Anything else? So, what should we write about? Does somebody have a story that we hadn't thought of yet that we should consider? What should we write about in 2015? I mean, mine's almost done, so I need ideas.
So it is 7:30, so we're happy to be here as long as you guys want to, but
right.
At this point, you can walk out without feeling that we're
Indeed.
embarrassed.
Indeed. We will not look back at the video and be like, oh, that one left first. No.
We had a big lunch, and so
yeah,
I could be here until 9 o'clock.
And thank you for showing up here in the basement. It's no, I feel most comfortable in these settings, but I don't know that's true of everyone.
I do want to say the website is decastories.com.
Yeah.
The Twitter is Deca Stories.
You see the thing that says mailing list? We will spam you a little, but we'll be really nice about it. So feel free to tell us who you are, and we will tell you interesting things in about a month.
Twitter is Deca Stories.
Twitter is Deca Stories.
There's a Facebook page, which I believe is public. It doesn't have anything on it yet, but it will by the end of the month.
You want a job? Yeah. And thank you. There we are, yeah? All right. Thank you all for coming.